and welcome back to Mike's Basement. Alright, so in this video I'm going to pick up a subject that I really didn't think I ever would do, and honestly I really don't know why I do it, because I am literally putting my hand into a wasp's nest. This is a subject that has been debated as long as I can remember in the audiophile and hi-fi enthusiast community, and I found that it is a subject that is also being debated heavily in the area where people record audio, mix and make music and all that. Nevertheless, I'll try to give you my take on this subject. I would like to make a disclaimer right off the bat. I am not an audio engineer. I'm not an engineer, I'm a physicist. So while I know somewhat great deal about how waves behave and the physics behind them, I'm not an expert in how the electrical signal inside a microphone works, or how the little nitty-gritty details in analog to digital conversion and all that works in an audio interface. Nevertheless, I'll give you what I know right now, what I've found, and then I will combine it with my opinion. So let's get going. By the end of this video, I hope that I have answered the question to fullest, which is, should you record with a higher sampling rate than standard? And does it matter? Let's go. In order to discuss this subject, we need to have a sort of reasonable understanding on how speech works. How does it work when I begin to talk to you and you stand there a couple of feet away and listen to me? Well, the physics of talking is that down in my throat I have what is called a vocal cords. And when I press air through them in a certain way, they begin to vibrate. That vibration will translate sound through the air to your ear, just like you can see on my little illustration here. And sorry, I'm not the best at drawing with a mouse in Photoshop, but I do my best for it. Also, I have a green screen behind me, and if that doesn't really work perfectly, I'm sorry for that as well. Now we have sort of a general overview of how this works. Let's go a little bit more into the details. So over here you can see the vocal cords, and I've tried to put sort of lines around them suggesting that when they vibrate, they generate movement of air. They generate vibrations in the air. Now, we also use our chest cavity and our head as resonance chambers, but I'm not going to go into details around that, because that's more of a subject on how you use your voice rather than how your voice works from a physical perspective. So we'll forego that. So that translates into what we call waves in the air. Now, the traditional way to look at waves is what we call transverse waves. As you can see here, we have sort of this wave here, we have a crest, we have a throw, we have a cycle, and all that amplitude of the wave. But that's really not how waves work when we generate sound with our vocal cords. What actually happens is that the movement that our vocal cords perform on the air, these vibrations, generate these areas with higher compression than normal and areas with lower compression than normal. And as these sort of areas traverse through the air, they generate waves in the air. Now, in order for you to hear these waves, because you can't just see them, right? You can't look, oh, you're talking. We have a little eardrum inside our ear. I hope you can see this figure here. It's big enough. So what happens is that the vibrations that my vocal cords generate translates through the air as longitudinal waves, and they will eventually hit your eardrum and make it vibrate with the same frequency, in the same way that my vocal cords made the air vibrate. And what happens in the ear, I'm not going to go into details with that, other than saying, well, that goes through a little a little combination of bones inside your ear, the staples and all that. And that translates the sound up to your inner ear, where it is converted into a electrochemical signal that your brain can interpret as sound. That's not really the point here. It's just to give you an overview of how this works if we were standing sort of face to face and talking. But we're not. So what happens in this case, as you can see right here, is that again, I'm standing here talking, I'm generating vibrations in the air, and those vibrations will hit the microphone that I have here, and then they will be translated through this wire that you see here, all the way over to my audio interface that is standing right here on my desk, over here, if I touch it right now. But let's concentrate for a moment first on the microphone. So what happens in the microphone is that right in here, I don't think you can see it, but in here there is what is called a diaphragm. It is basically, you could call it the eardrum of the microphone. It's a little metal plate that is suspended and given a charge, an electrical charge. Well, at least in a condenser mic it is, not in a dynamic mic. And when that membrane is electrically charged, my voice, the vibrations that I make in the air, will hit the membrane and make that vibrate. And that vibration will generate an electrical signal inside the microphone that is translated through the wire down to the audio interface. So that's basically what happens inside a microphone. You have different styles of microphone. You have large diaphragm, medium diaphragm, small diaphragm. You have condenser mics, you have ribbon mics, you have dynamic mics. They work on different ways, they have different functionalities, but the basic principle on how they work is the same. They have some sort of membrane that the vibrations you generate in the air with your vocal cords and your body and your resonance chambers will make that membrane vibrate. So the signal will translate through the wire, and however long that wire is, down to your audio interface. So in the interface, several things happens. Well, first of all, of course, the signal comes from the microphone down here into the audio interface. And again, my futile attempt to draw an audio interface for you. And the funny thing is that it doesn't really resemble the audio interface that I have, but let's forgo that for a while. The first stage that we have in your audio interface is what we call pre-amplification. So the signal that comes from the microphone, the electrical signal, is actually quite weak. There's not much juice in it. So if we were to just put it directly into the audio interface and begin to digitize the signal, you wouldn't really get anything out of it. So in order to give the audio interface, the digitizer, something to work with, we pre-amplify the signal. That means that you have a little gain knob that you turn, and when you find a good setting, you will use that as your gain. That is your pre-amplification level. Now, there's a little caveat here, because the pre-amplification can be too much. When we over-amplify our signal, we gain what is called clipping, and I can demonstrate that. So right now I'm speaking into the mic and it sounds very nice and my voice is very lovely. And as I turn up the gain, you should at some point hear me completely clipping the mic. And when that happens, instead of my voice sounding very nice, it still sounds like I'm trying to rip apart your ears. So I'll quickly turn back the levels again. So that is audio clipping. Why that happens, that is the subject for we'll get into later. But at this stage, let's just focus on that we call it pre-amplification. We amplify the signal from the microphone. Why is it called pre-amplification? I suppose it's because in a completely analog chain, you'd usually have a preamplifier for your microphones that you put all the microphones in, and then you'll route that signal in your mixer down to an amplifier, a real amplifier that routes the signal out to your loudspeakers. That is, as I understand it. If any of you are audio engineers or professional sound guys, anything like that, and I'm completely wrong, please put it in the comments below, because I would also like to learn something new. But that's how I understand it. But instead of sending the signal we get in our audio interface to a next chain that would be an amplifier for loudspeakers, we are instead sending the signal down here to a digitizer chain, or as we call it, an analog to digital converter, ADC. An interface like this also has what is called an digital to analog converter, that is an DAC or DAC. But in this case, we're going to focus mainly on the analog to digital converter. So notice here that in the preamplification stage, our signal is still analog. As we send it over to the digital parts of the signal, we will do two stages. The first stage will be the sampling, and the second stage will be the quantization, and then finally we will send the signal out to our digital audio workstation, or DAW, as you call it. That could be Reaper or Pro Tools or whatever you use, doesn't matter. Let's take a look first at the sampling stage. In order to try to explain what the sampling stage really is, and also the quantization stage, I'm going to give you sort of a more simple example, I think. A bouncing ball. So imagine that you have a friend who asks you, whatever your name is, let's call you Bob. Bob, I would like for you to record some data for me. I would like to try to emulate or try to test, model how a bouncing ball jumps when you drop it from a certain altitude and see how it performs. And you say, yeah, all right, Bob, that's okay. I'll do that for you. And you know a little bit about physics, so you know that you need sort of a plate or a screen on your wall where you have a meter, a centimeter measurement, a meter stick, and then you need to have some kind of time measurement. You know all that. And then you know that you have to drop the ball and then take measurements at a certain point in time. When you say to yourself, well, this is a bouncing ball, right? And it's not big experiment, a relatively small experiment. So I think I'll just go with one sample every second. So once 2 seconds pass, you take a sample, and then again 2 seconds pass and you take a sample. Think, all right, that's fine. So I'll go with that. So yeah, the sampling rate. So in order to get the sampling rate, we perform a little measurement system like this. So over here we have the height in centimeters and we have time in seconds. Notice that I haven't given it any numbers yet. That's on purpose. Alright. We'll go with the first example here. We give Bob our data. We make our measurements like this. So we have a sample rate, like I said, one sample every second. Meaning that our sample rate is actually 1/2 sample per second. That is 1/2 Hertz or 0.5 Hertz. So as you can see, we take a measurement here at 2 seconds, then we take a measurement here again at 2 seconds, and here at 2 seconds, and 2 seconds, and 2 seconds. And we send our data to our friend, and he plots it, and he says, really? Mike, this is what you're giving me? I can't use that. You need to give me more sample rates. I'll say, all right. Bob, I'll do that. I'll give you more samples. So you think to yourself, all right, let's try with one sample every second. So you do that. You take a sample every second, which is 1 Hertz. So your sample rate is 1 Hertz. And you get a graph like this. And your friend says, you know what? That's better. But I need better resolution. I can't model anything with this. And you say to yourself, gosh dang it. All right. I'll give you more resolution. So you say to yourself, I'll go with 2 Hertz this time, 2 samples per second. That must be enough. And you end up with this. And your friend goes, Bob, you nailed it. That's a good graph. I can use that. I hope that you understand what the sampling rate is here. Imagine that what the sampling rate is, that as the ball bounces, you take a snapshot with your camera in this case, every 2 seconds. So you'll click something like click, something like that, right? So you take 2 samples per second. That's your sampling rate. Now the reason why I haven't put numbers down here on the time axis is that you don't need to give your friend the time axis. You just have to tell him that you started at 0. That's reasonable to assume, right? And then he can figure out that since you have a sample rate of 2 samples per second, he can see every time he has 2 samples, 1 second has passed. So you don't need to give him the sample rate, you only need to give him the height in centimeters. And thereby comes the quantization stage. So what is that? Well, in this case, I've made sort of a rough measurement, and that's also on purpose to sort of really demonstrate what the quantization is. In this case, we have roughly a resolution of 5 centimeters. So we have 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and so forth. So the quantization stage is that in order to give your friend actual numbers that he can use in his model, you need to give him these numbers here, the data values. You don't need to give him the time, like I said, because that is included in the in your sample rate. You only need to give him these numbers here. In order to do that, you look at it, and this is actually how your audio interface will do it. It will say, all right, this first measurement here, it is right on at 70 centimeters, so I'll use that. Then down here it will say, all right, I think this is closer to 55 centimeters, so I'll use that. Over here you will say, all right, I think it's closer to 35 centimeters, so I'll use that. Down here we'll say, well, I think it's closer to 20 centimeters, so I'll use that. And down here we'll say, well, it's closer to 5 centimeters, I'll use that. And here 15, and so on, and so on, and so on. This is what the quantization is. You need to give the data, it has to be precise numbers. You can't just say, well, it's around 70 centimeters, because a computer can't understand around 70 centimeters. It either has to be 65 or 67 or 68 or 70 centimeters, whatever it is. Of course, if you increase the resolution of your meter stick out here, you'll get more precise values, but you still have to select the closest value. And that is exactly what the quantization is, also in audio. So now you might be thinking out there behind the screen and looking at me and say, all right, Mike, that's good. It's a good example. I understand that, but how the heck does that relate to audio? I mean, I'm not recording a bouncing ball. I'm recording my freaking voice. My voice is not a bouncing ball and up and down. And so how? What do you mean? Let's get to that. In order to explain how we can sample and quantize our audio signal, we now know that the audio signal is something physical, movement of air, and I touched the mic, sorry about that, that goes into a diaphragm on the microphone, through a wire as an electrical signal, down to an audio interface where this electrical signal is pre-amplified, and then some digitization happens, which we put into 2 stages. We have a sampling and we have a quantization. In order to understand how the sampling rate functions, we need to look at a very, very important theorem. So I'm introducing for you the Nyquist-Shannon theorem. What does that state? Well, if we look at it from a mathematical point of view, and I am a physicist, so I love mathematics, we can say that the maximum frequency we can resolve has to be less than half of our sampling frequency. Put in other terms, f sample has to be larger than 2 times the maximum frequency that we will resolve. If you're not a physicist or a mathematician, you just want to understand audio, then we can put it in words instead. So we have 2 requirements in order to uphold the Nyquist-Shannon theorem. First, any frequency can be perfectly sampled if the sampling frequency is more than twice the given frequency. So if I want to sample a maximum of 5,000 Hertz, 5 kilohertz, I need a sampling frequency of at least 10 kilohertz or more. Also, and this is very, very important, the highest sampled frequency must, and I should have underlined that and put bells around it, anything, must be perfectly band limited. Notice, take real notice of those words. Must be perfectly band limited. This is crucial to understand the rest of my argument here. All right. So with that in mind, let's continue. So let's look at the limits for human hearing because, well, that seems to be a good starting point, right? If you want to band limit something, it would be a good idea to at least not band limit it within our human hearing because then we'll lose some frequencies. The human hearing is usually limited from 20 Hz to 20 kHz. For example, my Audio Technica AT2020 here has an effective resolution from 20 Hz to 20 kHz. It seems reasonable, right? So according to the Nyquist-Shannon theorem, if we want to use 20 kHz as our highest frequency, our Fmax, we can choose a sample rate twice as high or more. That means that F sample must be higher than 40 kHz. I'm sorry, I wrote 41 here. It has to be higher than 40 kHz. In this case, I chose 41 kHz as the example. But we also need to perfectly band limit our signal. Yeah, that may be something. Let's take a practical example. Well, sort of. So I'll open Reaper here. And here I have some nice plugins. I use this Nova plugin. It's an equalizer, dynamic equalizer. I also use the standard in Reaper, but in this case, I think in order to illustrate to some extent what I'm talking about here, I think that using this dynamic equalizer here will do the job. So I have recorded a tone at around 200 Hz, at 220, I think it is. Let's try to listen back. Yeah, around 200 Hz. I could increase that up to around 20 kHz. I'm not going to do that. It's just to tell you if I made a sound around 5 kHz, it would pop up around here, 10 kHz around here, and 20 kHz around here. Notice also that we have these little wiggly lines from 20 kHz, from 20 Hz up to 20 kHz. And notice also that our spectrum down here, spectrum analyzer, goes all the way up to 40 kHz. That might mean something. Well, I'm not sure it means anything in this case, but it certainly helps us. So, what is this band limiting? Well, it is equivalent, if not exactly the same, as what we call a low-pass filter. So, just to make a brief introduction to some of the things we can do in audio, we can make a high-pass filter and we can make a low-pass filter. What does that mean? Well, a high-pass filter, you can understand it like this, that a high-pass filter will pass anything that is higher than the frequency you select. So, for instance, here I could choose anything from, I could band limit all the way up to 10 kHz if I wanted to. I could go down to 500 Hz. I could go all the way down to 20 Hz. I could just turn it off if I wanted to. That's a high-pass filter, but we don't have a problem according to the Nyquist-Shannon theorem with high passes. We don't have any problem with low frequencies. Our problem is the highest frequency. So let's turn that off and look instead at our low pass filter. So you can understand a low pass filter as the exact opposite. A low pass filter will pass anything below or lower than the frequency you choose, hence low pass filter. You also have high shelf and low shelf. They basically do the same, it's just the reversed. A high shelf will shelf anything higher than this, and a low shelf will shelf out anything lower than this. That's how they work. For instance, the standard, or you could call it the plugin, the equalizer plugin that comes with Reaper, both has high shelf and low shelf, and high pass and low pass. But in this case, we're just going with the low pass filter. So let's look at what it is we wanted to do. Let's take the perfect example, right? We're going to put in the best of the best low pass filter that we can find into our audio interface. And we set it exactly at 20 kilohertz. As you can see here, if we look at this, even a perfect, in this case, very, very good low pass filter, 72 decibels per octave, that's a pretty harsh cutoff, actually. Even in that case, setting it at 20 kilohertz, that won't work, right? Because we only had 50 hertz to work with if we chose 41 kilohertz as our sampling frequency. So here you see the problem. Herein lies really the problem. And I think also the area where this discussion really takes off. Because the Nyquist theorem is true. It is proven. It works. But it comes with that little thing after it. We have to band limit our signal. So in this case, we've chosen a really good band limiter. Let's say that it lands around, I don't know, 22 kilohertz, somewhere around that. It doesn't seem unreasonable. This is 30 kilohertz. So yeah, something like that. Let's say, or at least below. So we could increase our sampling rate, right? We can go up to, let's say, 44 kilohertz. That would give us a maximum frequency of 22 kilohertz. That seems to be reasonable. That's within our limit here. So we are good to go. But we could have a worse low pass filter. That's not unreasonable to assume that. So we land here around, I don't know, 28 kilohertz. That means that we need something around over 50, right? Let me just, I'm really terrible at calculating, so let me just get my phone. 50, sorry. This is really embarrassing, but sorry about that. Let's say, what was it? 28,000 times 2. Yeah, times 2. Yeah, 56,000. So we now need a sampling rate of 56,000 kilohertz. Sorry, hertz. 56 kilohertz. And as you can see, depending on the quality of our low pass filter in our system, and as you can see here, choosing a more less quality of a worse low pass filter, we are actually also cutting off the signal that we would like to have. So if I had to increase that, we would end up almost around 40 kilohertz, meaning that we have to go all the way up to something like 80 kilohertz in order to record that. And we could have an even worse cutoff filter. And if I put that, I can't even put it all the way out, but that would mean that we will probably end out, I don't know, somewhere around 60 kilohertz or something like that, meaning that we will go all the way up to 120 kilohertz. Exactly what frequency you need to consider here depends very much on the quality of the low pass filter in your audio interface. I would assume that you won't find many audio interfaces with a cutoff filter, a low pass filter, band limiter, whatever you want to call it, that is worse than something around 24 decibels per octave. I wouldn't assume that, but you can't know it. That's a very crucial point in this case here. I hope that you understand now why we need to consider all these things regarding the band limiter and where we need to set our sampling frequency. From exactly these considerations, there were named 2 audio standards for CDs and videos. So movies. So let's take those. In order to negate the effect of these non-perfect low-pass filters, it was decided that for audio CDs we would have a standard of 44.1 kilohertz. This meant that with a 20 kilohertz band limited signal, there would be 2050 hertz of room for the low pass filter to cut the signal with no aliasing. So I haven't spoken about aliasing, and to be frank, I won't go into much detail about what aliasing really is. There are many videos out there on YouTube that can explain it much better than I and give practical examples where you can see what aliasing actually is. I might even put a few downs in the section below that you can follow. But I can say this much: if you have a signal, let's say that you have 44.1 kilohertz as your sample rate, and when you have a signal that goes above these 22,050 hertz, you'll begin to have aliasing, and that will present itself as when your audio goes beyond the frequency, the band limit, the limit by the Nyquist theorem, you'll get another source of audio that is almost a reflection of the one that passed, going the other way. And as you increase in frequency, you'll get more and more of these frequencies that pop up that will distort the signal. And that is what is called aliasing. So in order to negate this, the standard was 44.1 kilohertz. So we could cut off and have room to cut off with these non-perfect low-pass filters. For some reason, I don't really know, for film audio, the standard was chosen to be 48 kilohertz. This gives 4 kilohertz of room for the low-pass filter to cut the signal. But as far as I understand it, that was not the reason why they chose 48 kilohertz. As to my best knowledge, it was simply just because they wanted to choose something that was different from the 44.1, but still reasonable within the limits of the Nyquist-Shannon theorem. Alright, so I hope that this now gives you sort of a reasonable understanding of what sample rate is and why we have chosen these numbers that you often hear, 44.1 kilohertz and 48 kilohertz. Let's move on. We do have a problem now. Do we know the quality of our low-pass filter in the consumer products that we have? And more importantly, can we assume that our audio interface is perfectly band limited, even at 48 kilohertz? That's an interesting question. Let's move on and we'll discuss that later on. So here is the stage 3, our quantization. So how does that work in audio? Well, bit depth. What is that? Let's take it from the basics. In the electrical circuit that you can have, it can have 2 stages. Even the light switch can have 2 stages, on or off. You can't have anything between. You can have half on, half off. You can only have on or off. Now that's it. A complex set of circuits can have many stages of on and off, and that can route it around, but still the basics is on and off. So a computer, which is basically a large pile of very, very intricate electrical circuits and components and all that, they use the language of binary numbers, because in binary language we can have 0, that could be off, we can have 1, could be on, for example. It can also be reversed. So 1 bit can hold 2 pieces of information, 0 or 1. 2 different pieces of information, 0 or 1. Alright. So, if you're as old as me, try to remember back to the good old days where we have Windows 3.1. A lovely 16-bit system. So, what did that really mean? Well, for one thing, Windows 3.1 could then handle 2 to the power of 16-bit, that is 65,536 bytes. That equals to around 65 megabytes of RAM. If you put more than 65 megabytes of RAM into your computer, Windows 3.1 wouldn't recognize it as usable RAM. So with Windows 95, the 32-bit system was introduced. So in that case, Windows 95 could handle 2 to the power of 32 bits, that is 4,294,967,296 bytes, roughly equals 4 gigabytes of RAM. Again, the story is the same. If you put more than 4 gigabytes of RAM into your Windows 95 or even Vista, any 32-bit system, it wouldn't recognize the additional RAM. And so finally, as far as I remember it, around Windows 2K 2000, we got a true 64-bit system. So in this case, Windows 2K 64-bit could handle 2 to the power of 64-bit, and I really won't try to pronounce that. But roughly speaking, it is equivalent to 18 exabytes of RAM. That is more than gigabytes, that's more than terabytes, that's exabytes of RAM. 10 to the power of 18, sorry. That's 18 exabytes of RAM. And you can sit down there again and say, yeah, well, Michael, that's a nice story about I'm 16 years old. I really don't know what Windows 3.1 is, other than I read about it. And it's a nice little anecdote, and I understand all that with to the power of 2 and 64-bit and all that. But how the heck does that relate to audio once again? Let's look at that. We learned before that the human hearing is limited to around 20 kilohertz. That's the highest frequency that we can hear. But we're also limited in the case of the dynamic range that we can hear, meaning the range from the quietest sound that we can possibly hear to the loudest we can safely hear, or even above what we can safely hear. The human hearing has a dynamic range of roughly around 120 decibels, but in general, we can only hear up to 90 decibels safely. Anything above that may give us permanent hearing damage or hearing loss, and we don't want that. Where I live here in Denmark, the authorities, they've chosen to state that anything above 80 decibels is dangerous to us. So that is sort of in the work environment and all that. We should try to, if you don't have any hearing protection on, you should try to keep the loudest part of the machinery that you have, anything like that, below 80 decibels. So in this case, you could say that when we're recording audio, we would at least like to have 80 decibels of dynamic range, but preferably possibly around 90 decibels instead. So just like with anything else on a computer, audio signals that we put into the computer, they have to be quantized in order for the computer to use it. And just like with everything else inside the computer, it has to be in the binary format. Let's make some quick calculations here in order to sort of set the stage. So we have an 8-bit audio recording, or anything, 8-bit something. That would give us 2 to the power 8, that is 256 different discrete values that we can work with. For 16-bit, that would be 65,536 different values. 24-bit, around 16 million different values. And again, for 32-bit, around 4 billion different discrete values that we can work with. How does that relate to audio? Well, let's say in order to put around 80 decibels of dynamic range into an 8-bit file, we will need a range between each individual value to be around 3.2 values per decibel. Now, the lowest possible value in this system, in this recording, called the noise floor. In order for us not to hear any distinct leveling of the audio, you can imagine sort of a sudden jumps up and down in the loudness, in the audio level, we need at least around 12 values per decibel. Said in another way, we need at least 6 decibels of dynamic range per bit. And here you can imagine the extreme case. Imagine you only had 1 bit, meaning 2 possible values to fit in 80 decibels of dynamic range. That would mean that you could either have your noise floor just, or you could have the top, which would be the actual loudest part that you can hear. So you would go between all the way around. That wouldn't be very nice, huh? So let's look at the calculation once again. 8 bits, that would give us around 48 decibels of dynamic range. Not enough. 16 bits would give us 96 bits of dynamic range. 24 bits would give us 144 decibels of dynamic range. And finally, 32 bits gives us 192 decibels of dynamic range. So, 16 bits, 96. Sounds good, right? Here's a convention that you want to learn, and that ties in with what I talked about in the start about clipping the audio, and you could hear it very well that I clipped the audio. It sounded distorted. It sounded like I was trying to rip out the eardrum of your ear or something like that. So in general, it makes most sense to say that the absolute quietest thing, I mean silence or noise floor in that case, would be 0 decibels, no sound at all. And as the signal goes louder, the decibels goes positive, so 20 decibels, 30 decibels, 60, and that would be louder and louder and louder. And when you have audio measurement tools on your phone or anything like that, it is usually the case, and like I said, you measure up to around 90 decibels, in Denmark up to 80 decibels, and then you say anything above 80 decibels is considered dangerous and should be alleviated in some way. But in audio systems, we have chosen to put 0 decibels as the loudest possible value you can have before clipping, and then lower values goes negative. So when you try to reach the maximum level that you can have in an audio recording, you try to get it as close to 0 decibels as possible. That is the safe value that you can have without clipping. You can go above, but as you could hear, then you clip the audio. So for instance, in this case, a 24-bit audio recording would have a noise floor around minus 144 decibels. Let's see a little bit about that in practice. And again, I'm going to open my trusted workstation here, Reaper. So I have recorded the noise floor of my computer. So it's not even the audio interface. It's actually a recording of this tone here that you have, but we can see the noise floor. And I've put in some spectral analyzers so we can look at it. So I've made the recording that you heard before of the 220 Hz tone, and I have output that to a 32-bit file, a 24-bit file, a 16-bit file, and an 8-bit file. Let's start by listening to the 32-bit file and look at the spectrum. So here's the spectrum analyzer. I'll make it as big as I can. There we go. I'm integrating over roughly 2 seconds, no slope. The floor is around minus 243 decibels. We're using some Blackman-Harris filter, and the fast filter transform resolution is 4096. Let's try to play it back and see what we can see. So we have the tone right here around 200 Hz. That's nice. And then let me just mute it. Alright, so I just muted the audio here so that we can I can unmute it again, but so we don't get annoyed by the sound. But as you can see here, we have the audio recording here, the sine wave, and it's around 220 Hertz, around here somewhere. And as you can see, as we go down from the audio, we have a noise floor that lands roughly around 163 decibels. Like I said, the numbers that we should get from a 32-bit file was around 196, and it's not perfect here, but it's lower, as you can see. So this is the noise floor for a 32-bit file audio output. Let's try to look at it from a 16-bit file instead. So I'll do the same again. I will unmute it. Make it a little bit bigger. Again, we have the same setup. Let's play it. And mute. And let me see if I can stop it. Yeah, I can. Alright, so first thing you notice is that we have a little bit of noise down here. We have the same tone, we have the same slope, but we have more noise down here as the noise floor. So that means that our noise floor would probably be around 163 instead, but we expected it to be minus 144. So this is a 24-bit file. It might be, you can see the noise floor around 144 is around here, right? So you can say roughly we do have a noise floor in that area. But in general, the audio interface, the audio noise goes a little bit down in this case. It can also be due to the way that the frequency is analyzed. It's not to be sort of specific about the exact values, but just to demonstrate where the noise floor is and what it is. So imagine that you had sound below this. Well, some of it would drown in the noise. I actually have an example of that. So let's look at the 16-bit file instead. Let's unmute it and let's open the spectrum analyzer. Do the same again, make it bigger. Start the recording. Mute it. And now you see something very different. Instead of having this slope, we actually have a nice straight line where we actually have a noise floor that is around minus 114 decibels, roughly speaking. So it's a little bit better than the 96 decibels we expected, but still significantly raised compared with the 32-bit file and 24-bit file. So here lies the noise floor. Now I'm quite positive that the noise floor of my audio interface is way above. I think it's around 120. So the noise floor of a 16-bit file would still be way better than the noise floor on my audio interface. So let's see what happens if we choose an 8-bit file. We're going to unmute it, open the spectrum analyzer again, and now I want you to do two things. I want you to listen to the sound and look at the spectrum at the same time. I know, multitasking, but try to notice what has happened. Can you hear it? Let's mute it and look. So what has happened here? What did happen? What happened was that... Let's mute it again because it's annoying to listen to. What has happened here is that you can see we still have our little wave around here, our 220 Hertz or whatever it was that I chose. But now the noise floor of our 8-bit resolution file has gone so high, almost up to the point where we can hear it, right around 60 to minus 60 decibels. We can hear that. That gives the signal to noise ratio of 3. Let's compare that with the 32-bit file. If we can do such a thing. Let's open this one. Unmute it. And keep it. Let's take a look. In this case, let's say this is our noise floor. Let's say 138. It gives a signal to noise of 7. So almost a doubling of the signal to noise ratio. So definitely, if you recorded all your audio with an 8-bit signal, you'd actually raise the noise floor so high that you can hear it in your audio recording. I haven't made any sort of a vocal comparison, but you can do it yourself. Try to record anything through your mic and then output it as an 8-bit file. You'll definitely hear it. Now I want to introduce another standard for you, and that is, in order to fit all the possible useful dynamic range onto an audio's compact disc, the standard of 16 bits were chosen. This gave a dynamic range of 96 decibel, which is all the range humans can safely listen to. To my best knowledge, it is the same bit depth for movie audio as well. So we actually had for a brief moment the Super Audio CD or SACD, which gave us around 20 bit of resolution. But where did they go? I haven't seen any Super Audio CDs or any Super Audio players in a long time. At least not as sort of general commercial products. If you go into a hi-fi store, a hi-fi enthusiast store, you might find some of them, but in general, I haven't seen any anywhere in a long time. And I was alive and I can remember when they came out. I was relatively young, but I can't remember it. Now I hope you have a pretty good understanding what sampling rate is and how it relates to audio recording, and what quantization is and how that relates to audio recording. You can say in general that the quantization of your audio signal is the same as the quantization of the bouncing ball example. When you choose a higher bit depth, you can lower the noise floor, but you also have a more fine-grained resolution to put in your values. You can also say that you get more lower noise floor, meaning that you can record quieter and quieter before you hit the noise floor. Nevertheless, going to a higher bit rate or bit depth will give you more dynamic range, more resolution to put in all your audio into. So that's how that relates. You can use probably sitting there asking yourself, so Michael, that's good. Now I understand it, but do I need to record at a higher sample rate? And the short and definite answer to that is no, you don't. With a good audio interface and a decent low-pass filter built in, not a plugin in your audio recording software, your DAW, anything, in the interface itself. If it has a not perfect, not good, just decent low-pass filter, 48 kHz or 44.1 kHz is just fine. It's all you need to have in order to record perfect audio. Again, remember the Nyquist-Shannon theorem. It states, well, I didn't exactly word it like that, but what it also says is that if you adhere to all the requirements of the Nyquist-Shannon theorem, any recording that you might make, any recording in that frequency spectrum, that frequency area that you have chosen, can be reproduced perfectly down to the very finest minute detail of whatever audio you are recording. That's it. So again, with a decent low-pass filter, 48 kHz, 44.1 kHz, it's just fine. All you need, and you can reproduce perfect audio. However, if you choose to record at 88.2 or 96 or 176.4 or even 192 kHz, you'll ensure that you don't have a low-quality low-pass filter as the bottleneck in your audio system. Because remember, even though your system is set up so that you don't really sample anything below 20 Hz or anything above 20 kHz, when you extend the amount that you can choose, when you go from, in this case, 44.1 kHz as your limiting factor, you have very much room. You have almost 20 kHz from the 20 kHz up to the 44.1 kHz. You have actually 24.1 kHz. And you have even more room if you go up to 96, which is 48, highest frequency, 176.4, and above that. As you go above that, you give your system more room to implement that low-pass filter. Now you may have an audio device with a perfect low-pass filter, not decent, perfect. But still recording at a higher sample rate will ensure you that you don't, that low-pass filter, whatever quality it is, will be the limiting factor. So, should you? No. Can you? Sure, if you have the option and you want to do it, do it. But remember, one important thing, and I don't think this is sort of comes as a big surprise. If you sample more finely, if you sample more samples per second, then of course you put more data into your data file. You put more data into your recording, meaning get bigger files. So I can't remember the exact number, but I think going from 48 to 192 would increase your file size by a factor of 8, roughly. Maybe a factor of 4. I can't really remember the exact numbers, but going from 48 kHz to 192 will increase your data file size. Conversely, you're probably also sitting there and wondering for yourself, all right, Alright, Mike, I think I know what sample rate I should record at now, but what bit depth should I choose then? Do I need to use higher bit depth? And again, the answer is no. Just like we saw before, a bit depth of 16-bit will give you 96 decibels of dynamic range, which is more than enough to satisfy whatever sound you'll put in within the human hearing, our dynamic range. It's not a problem. But again, if you choose to use 24-bit instead, it will give you 144 decibels of dynamic range. That means that you can sort of roughly say that it will give you 27 decibels of dynamic range of each side, meaning, let's say you want to record the 90 decibels of dynamic range. Going up to 144 will give you 27 decibels of dynamic range on top of that, and 27 decibels of dynamic range below that, meaning that your leveling, when you sort of set your levels in your audio, doesn't have to be exact, doesn't have to be precise. Whereas if you go with a 16-bit recording, it will give you the 96 decibels of dynamic range, which will roughly give you around 3 decibels above and below your dynamic range, the 90 decibels, meaning that you have a lot less wiggle room to set your levels when you do your recording. Like I said, this means that your levels, if you choose the 24-bit file, your levels doesn't need to be very precise. But you don't get any better sound by choosing 24-bit or 32-bit or anything like that. You get more dynamic range, you get more wiggle room for your levels, but your audio will be no better. It will have no better resolution, it will have no better clarity or anything like that by choosing a higher sample rate or choosing a higher bit depth. That is also why the audio standard has been that for compact disc, we go with 44.1 kHz at 16-bit depth, because that is all the resolution, all the sample rate we need in order to reproduce good, lovely, warm, fuzzy, good audio. That's all you need. But you can choose to go higher if you so choose so. That choice is up to you. Alright, I hope that this video has been educational for you, perhaps even a little bit entertaining. Just as always, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up, and if you want to follow me and see what else I put out and of shenanigans and all that, then click the subscribe button down below and that little bell. I really hope that this video might have given you a little bit more insight into what you should do when you record with all that, with sample rate and bit depth and all that. And if not, well, I suppose there are other videos out there that can give you more of the nitty-gritty details of why you should do one or the other. My personal opinion is that people on both sides have some truth to their argument. The people on one side that states that you don't need higher than 44.1 kHz or 48 at 16-bit depth in order to reproduce the audio that you put in perfectly, they're absolutely right. But it is under that circumstance, that requirement, that the low-pass filter that you have in your recording device is good enough that it can cut off the signal within the limitation of the Nyquist-Shannon theorem. And therein also the other side of the argument have some valid points. Those people on the other side of the argument that says, well, if you go with a higher sample rate, then at least you are ensuring yourself that whatever quality of low-pass filter you have in your audio device, that won't be a limiting factor. And also, in the same way, those people that say going with a higher bit depth will ensure that you have more wiggle room to set your levels so you don't have to be very precise, they are also right. That is also accurate. But the notion that higher sample rate and higher bit depth will give you better, more clear audio, that is wrong. The choice, whatever you want to do, whatever you want to record at, that's perfectly up to you. Alright, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.